The game industry likes to remaster things lately, so I wanted to do the same. Let's chat about bad game movies in the comments, but first, my opinion. I'm Tarmack, and this is Feature Creep. It is long since time for the video game industry to give up on its desire for societal approval by attempting to mirror other industries, or so we can all hope. The first real video game movie that was ever done was the Super Mario Bros. In 1993. A hopeless rip-off of the style and form of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles live-action 1990 film. TMNT cost $13 million to make, and made back a cool $200 million at the box office. Super Mario Bros., on the other hand, cost $48 million to make, and made only $21 million of that back because it was terrible and everyone knew it was terrible. Of course, it also came at a time when video games were still a complete cultural reject pastime, so maybe it would do better in today's everyone is a gamer climate. It's still terrible, though. The game industry itself has for a long time had this weird fascination with the movie industry. Gaming is looked up to film as something of a cooler big brother that doesn't know or care that you exist. As a result, there have been a reasonably significant number of video game-based movies, with everything from the aforementioned Mario Bros. Up to the more recent Blizzard passion project in Warcraft. The problem with them is that in nearly every case, they're bad movies. And in most cases, they're not just bad, they're downright terrible. In fact, if you follow much in the way of film rating, you know that both Game Industry Bonus Barometer, Metacritic, and a site called Rotten Tomatoes are kind of the be-all to end-all of movie ratings. Only one game movie has ever gotten higher than a 50% on Metacritic, and 0 game movies have gotten higher than that on Rotten Tomatoes. What is somewhat suiting in all of this is that, in my not-so-humble opinion, we got the first video game movie that was good before game-based movies started becoming more common. The original Mortal Kombat with Christopher Lambert as Raiden. You know, it may not get amazing ratings on Metacritic or Rotten Tomatoes, but in my view, Mortal Kombat is a good movie based on a good franchise and definitely worth watching. Do not mistake this for Mortal Kombat Annihilation. If you come back here complaining because I said Mortal Kombat is something you should watch and you watched Annihilation, that will be an immediate penance of 20 hours of No Man's Sky that you will be sentenced to perform. I'm also not convinced that the first Resident Evil was all that bad, but then I'm not a movie critic. There are just so many bad game movies. Mario Bros., Street Fighter Wing Commander, Tomb Raider, Doom, Blood Rain, Hitman, Hitman Again with Agent 47, Postal, Silent Hill, Need for Speed, Max Payne, Alone in the Dark, Assassin's Creed, Tekken, Far Cry, and a whole bunch of Resident Evil sequels. We had Warcraft recently, which I'll admit I enjoyed, but was precisely as well written as the World of Warcraft lore, which is to say, not very. And Warcraft, of all game movies, had far and away the best box office sales by almost $100 million over the next in line. The Angry Birds movie, which incidentally is also the second highest rated video game movie to date. Just think about that. The Angry Birds movie is close to the best we've gotten. That cuts me deep. So it's worth asking the question, why do all of these game movies get made if they're so bad? Let me tell you the tale of the worst movie director and producer who has ever graced the silver screen, leaving it more tarnished than when he arrived. Uwe Boll. Mr. Boll is responsible for at least 12 video game movies, and that's just at first blush, without me going through each of his films and trying to figure out if there's some kind of loose game connection. Such amazing titles as House of the Dead, Alone in the Dark, Blood Rain, Postal, and Far Cry. None of his video game movies have broken out of single-digit percentages for rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and his lowest-rated film is Alone in the Dark, based on the game industry darling that sparked much of the horror genre that we know today of the same name. His film got 1%. Of course, not everything is about ratings, so what about his illustrious career at the box office? Well, essentially all of his game industry films failed, miserably, several of them spending tens of millions to be made and getting less than $1 million back in revenue. So why, as a director of continuing failures, would he keep getting money invested to make terrible video game movies? Well, I hate to break it to you folks, but the movie industry isn't all about art. Up until 2005, there were some pretty incredible tax rebates in Germany, where Boll is from, which resulted in only having to pay tax on profits from movies. Germany put this tax rebate into effect to incentivize film production locally, of course. But what if you set up your own companies for consulting and various other services which you sell to your movie-making company that always seems to post losses? Well, all of a sudden, instead of paying government taxes on profits and having to pay out royalty splits and revenue shares, you've turned it into personal income. Wouldn't that be a slick way of doing things? intentionally not making money because you can pay back your investment with interest and still make a lot of money yourself personally, but without posting a profit on your movie. And Boll isn't the only one who appears to do this. Based on the analysis and opinions of myself and others, he's just one of the more prolific. You'll find that loads of movies don't make a profit, something like the Lord of the Rings franchise, for example. The Tolkien estate had to go as far as suing New Line Cinema because the trilogy, that cost somewhere in the area of $300 million to make and received approximately $3 billion in box office revenue, somehow failed to generate a profit, and the Tolkien estate had signed a contract for a percentage of profits. They had to sue because New Line didn't pay them any royalties precisely because of that lack of profit. Now, in order to bring this back to the game industry, I'd like to pose a question to you. Unlike the movie industry, we don't get sales numbers on games in a reliable way. So when a game developer or publisher says that they have to put microtransactions into a game in order to support continued development, or that they couldn't afford to make the game without DLC, I want you to internally just ask the question, what tax benefits are involved here? What other corporate benefits could exist which might be offsetting the increasing cost of development handily that we just don't see? What brings the dodos home to roost on this concept of bad movies being made because even failures can still make money is that there is another industry we all know and love that in many places has very significant tax rebates. Quebec in Canada, for example, the home of Ubisoft. In 2014, Quebec cut tax rebates that were then reinstituted in 2015. BioWare, being located in Edmonton, is actually a very oddball situation, as for years, no dedicated tax credit existed in the province that I call home. There are also significant rebates in Vancouver, BC for film, which is why a lot of motion capture is done there. All of this raises a very interesting question about the profitability of video games, especially related to microtransactions and product failures. A tax rebate at the end of the year is there for the business balance sheet, and in the case of Quebec, the rebate can apply per project or on the business as a whole. A game that only sells enough to at the gross revenue level break even, if built in a place like Quebec with its proper French translation rule compliance, is going to get a rebate against their eligible labor up to 37.5% of what they spend, with eligible meaning anybody that makes under $100,000 a year. So even a break-even game by normal costs and revenue should still make Ubisoft some solid cash. As an alternative, this kind of labor rebate could in theory allow Ubisoft to pay higher than average salaries to attract the best talent, though I haven't seen any evidence that this is the case. That's not a dig against the talent, Ubisoft clearly has some very good game developers. But only having to pay $63,000 in salary for a $100,000 a year job is a pretty hefty reduction in your business costs. It really throws a wrench into the whole games are more expensive to develop these days, doesn't it? There were no 30+% rebates for game developers 10 to 20 years ago. Now, I am not making a claim that games are being made as trash intentionally in the same way that you might see in the movie industry, but it's always worth being aware of massive rebates and tax credits of this kind, and it's always worth being skeptical when a game is deemed a failure. Failure does not always mean a loss, and while the profit a particular game generated may not make shareholders weep with glee, sometimes those investments were done with the intent of furthering engine tech or other longer-term goals. And at the end of the day, I think it's very interesting that a little story about bad video game movies can give a bit of context into the game industry of the present day. So let's chat about bad game movies in the comments below. I always read every comment on these videos, even if I don't have time to reply to everyone. I'd also like to take this time to, from the bottom of my heart, thank everyone who watches my stuff on a regular basis, but also specifically call out those who have been here for a long time. This video marks the 200th Feature Creep episode, nearly 5 years after I started this series. And since we're talking about game movies, nostalgia, and all that jazz, I'd like to close this episode up a little bit differently. The video game industry likes remastering that stuff, and that's what this episode is. A remastered version of the first Feature Creep video I ever did. So to finish this off, I'm going to subject all of you to just how far my content has improved since April 23rd of 2012. I hope you can cringe right along with me if you've never seen this. My name's Tarmack, and here's Feature Creep Episode 1. Can we stop making video game movies now, please? There have been exactly 2 good video game movies so far, the first Mortal Kombat and the first Resident Evil. Some people did enjoy Silent Hill, and the pair of Final Fantasy movies that were released outside of Japan were passable. Other than that, we're just left with a pretty sizable list of utter garbage trying to capitalize on the success of great and bad video games with less than a paper-thin effort to make the product good. The Halo movie very recently fell off the table during contract negotiations with Microsoft, and we're still waiting to find out what happens with this World of Warcraft movie. Personally, I see that one getting dropped in the trash being more and more likely as subscriber numbers keep falling. I'm sick to death of the marketing abuse, and that's really what this whole movement is. It's no better than putting out lunchboxes or any number of other pieces of junk, abusing the fan mentality because they'll buy anything with a certain brand on it. Mario Brothers, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat Annihilation, Tomb Raider, Double Dragon, House of the Dead, Alone in the Dark, Wing Commander, Doom, Blood Rain, Far Cry, Max Payne, Hitman, Prince of Persia, and numerous Resident Evil sequels, all bad. Until you start putting real effort into making a movie with real depth, this is just fancore abuse. That's all I have to say. Tarmack out.